Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. Today, CEO Steve Durbin sits down with Alexander Seger, head of the Cybercrime division at the Council of Europe. They discuss ways to promote cooperation between private businesses and law enforcement agencies, the challenges of investigating and prosecuting cybercrimes across multiple jurisdictions, and recent developments with the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime that could mitigate those challenges.
Alexander, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast. The topic today is cybercrime, something that is obviously at the top of a large number of people's agendas now, both in terms of how to resist it and indeed, I suppose, in how to go about committing it on certain sides. You are the head of the Cybercrime division at the Council of Europe. We have something of a global audience for this podcast. Just explain to people, if you wouldn't mind, what exactly does that mean? What is your job, if you like?
I'm at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg in France, but I'm also in Bucharest in Romania, half of my time, and I'll explain about that in a second. The Council of Europe, just over 20 years ago, launched the first international treaty on cybercrime. The so-called Budapest Convention on Cybercrime was opened for signature in November 2001. And yes, elaborated by the Council of Europe, but we had also Canada, Japan, United States, South Africa participating in it. And today, this is a treaty which has 66 states that are parties to it, and another 14 that have signed it or been invited to accede, and over 125 states that have followed the principles of this treaty and implemented it as domestic law. So my function is to support the committee of the parties, the 66 plus 14 states that are participating in it. My job also, and that's the Bucharest part, is where we do capacity building. We support countries worldwide in improving their legislation, training their law enforcement, engage in public-private cooperation, engage in international cooperation, etc. And my job also has been, during the past 4 years, to support the parties to the Budapest Convention in the negotiation of a new second additional protocol to the treaty that we will open for signature in May this year, in about 3 months.
Excellent. And obviously, one of the things that people, I think, are interested in hearing about is because this is a very significant change, isn't it? This is something that is very, very special, very, very different. How is that, do you think, going to change the overall landscape from a cybercrime perspective? What is going to be the impact of these changes you've just been talking about?
If we look at what are the primary challenges, I mean, there are lots of threats around. There are so many threats around. Now, we cannot list them in this podcast here, but from ransomware to content-related issue, hate speech, and so on, which is a very difficult topic to address, election interference, and so on. But in practical terms, a primary challenge is investigating cybercrime or investigating any crime where evidence is in electronic form on a computer system, because that evidence may not be in your own territory. It may be held by a service provider in a foreign jurisdiction. It may be in unknown jurisdiction. It may be shifting, moving, fragmented over different jurisdictions. So the main problem that we have been looking into over the past few years is how to obtain the disclosure of electronic evidence in a much more effective way, and at the same time also meet human rights and rule of law, including data protection safeguards that are particularly dear to European countries.
Mm-hmm. And what has been the kind of response from the participants in putting this work together?
Well, it has been a very difficult task because for the first time we tried to put in international agreement in binding international law, direct cooperation between law enforcement in one country and private sector entities in another country, without going necessarily through the authorities of that other country.
Right.
And they, of course, sovereignty and this and that. And private sector entities, of course, are highly concerned about that because they say, okay, are we now expected to be the judges to decide whether we respond or not? Will we respond to you, but then we get into trouble about our data protection with our data protection authorities and so on? It has been very difficult. That's why it has taken us 96 sessions to negotiate this.
Right.
But we are almost there. We are there, actually. It will be open for signature on the 12th of May. So And the private sector was in many ways, on the one hand, reluctant. Civil society organizations were not very pleased with this. But then on the other hand, private sector entities also said, okay, it helps us get legal certainty. We will avoid conflicts of law. If under one law we are obliged to cooperate, on the other we prevented from cooperating, here is the solution. So overall, major players in the private sector were cooperative. They were looking forward to the results. And from some of them where we got feedback about what the outcome is, the feedback is positive.
And how do you think this is going to change the overall cybercrime landscape globally once this comes into effect?
I think we will have not only a change in the cybercrime landscape there also, but in the landscape altogether when it comes to public-private cooperation between law enforcement and private sector entities, and also relating to evidence that is not necessarily related to cybercrime. A kidnapping case, a child abuse case, which is not necessarily online, but maybe in other fora, or terrorism threats, where you can cooperate much more effectively now. So I believe we will get away from this 0.01 prosecution rate to something much higher. We get more confidence in the fact that criminal justice authorities can actually make a difference and achieve results. And one important point I see also is that we may get a criminal justice response, a more effective criminal justice response, as opposed to a national security response to the problem of cybercrime, because we are a bit apprehensive that, like in the case for terrorism, that the response moves from the criminal justice sector with the protections that you have there to the national security side, where there is much less control over what security bodies are doing. The primary concern also for many private sector entities. Here you have something where something is in the criminal justice arena, it can be challenged and so forth. So I think it will be of benefit to everyone if we can get this more effective criminal justice response. And I think it will make a difference in terms of prosecution, investigations, adjudications, and so on.
That's excellent. And some would say, I think listening to this, it's not before time, because one of the challenges that has always existed is how do we share better across nation states? How do we make sure that across businesses, across the private sector, we're able to, I think, probably have a lot more confidence is probably the right word in law enforcement's ability to support. I think one of the criticisms has always been that private sector businesses are interested in prevention, whereas law enforcement perhaps traditionally has been more interested in actually catching the criminals and being able to be measured in that way. So it is a big shift, isn't it? It's a big change. A lot of people listening to this as well may be thinking, okay, well, that's great. They may also be thinking, well, I hadn't heard about this. How do I get involved? So if somebody is interested in understanding more about what we've just been talking about, what are the steps that they can take? What should they do?
They can contact me or check also online for information. The question is who and for what purpose?
Right.
For example, with criminal justice authorities, we cooperate every day from any corner of the world. I mean, we're currently working with Nauru in the South Pacific on improving the legislation, and we've been working with Sierra Leone in Africa and so on. So we work with law enforcement, criminal justice authorities all over the world, and strangely enough, they do find us. So with them, we have no difficulties. We're also cooperating quite a lot, and we have participated also in those negotiations over the last few years with some major players, with Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and so on. They have been very much aware of what we are doing. They contributed, they provided written inputs, and so forth. Maybe some of the other providers, other type of private sector entities, with those, we would be very much interested in cooperating a bit more with fora like the one that you are involved in.
Right.
We can certainly do more industry associations and so forth. So we are now reflecting currently, we started to reflect how we can create a more frequent dialogue. Because what many private sector entities are telling us, and I had a discussion with them just 2 weeks ago with some of them, we would like to reach out on a more regular basis to key criminal justice experts in different countries, and have an exchange and tell them this is right now our concern. And law enforcement also to tell private sectors this is our concern. You're never responding, and then the private sectors will say, okay, but maybe you're sending to the wrong address, you're using the wrong template, or you don't use the template at all, or we cannot verify that you're a genuine representative of a criminal justice authority, and so on. So This is what we are now thinking of to do next. With this protocol being open for signature, we have to look into the practicalities of implementing it. And this is one of the areas we are discussing right now.
So lots of movement, lots of progress in that space. Let's move now to look at cybercrime in a bit more detail, because I'm interested in getting some of your views on things that are really occupying the minds of ISF members at the moment. You may be aware, we run a whole series of response simulations that our members can participate in, how to deal with ransomware, how to deal with other elements of cybercrime, for instance. And I pull out ransomware as the example because certainly as I talk to members and other CISOs all around the world, that seems to be the one that is of most concern at the moment. And I think Interpol has also pulled that out as being something that's they're concerned about. What's your take on ransomware? Are we approaching the end of that, or is it really something that we're just going to have to live with from now through the next years? Will it become business as usual?
Well, hopefully it will not become business as usual, but there are lots of open questions there.
Yeah.
And lots of concerns or issues that companies, that law enforcement run into. One of them is the question of confidence, what we discussed a bit earlier in this podcast here. A company that is a victim, do they have confidence enough that if they go to law enforcement, that something will happen there? Do they get the support? Will they be exposed as a victim and run into reputational problems, etc., etc.? So I think this is something to be looked in. And we have to look into this not just from a single country perspective. Now we say we in the UK, or we in the US, or we in Germany, or we in Australia. It has to be looked into as an international issue where we're also strengthening the capacity and getting the readiness of other countries to cooperate with each other and so forth. So lots of challenges. We had a very silly situation in a way. The countries say, but there is an issue of criminalizing ransomware. It's not really covered, in our legislation, whatever.
Right.
So we would not be able to cooperate because, the dual criminality issue is not there. Wrong. We are now probably preparing in the very near future a guidance note to show, for example, of how the provisions of the Budapest Convention can be applied to ransomware, to criminalize ransomware, but also to cooperate against ransomware. So again, strange enough, it's not a new phenomenon, and many countries have taken important steps. But I still have the feeling that many are taken by surprise. I don't really know what to do yet, but I think we will get there. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will not be there forever.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things about the whole security space, isn't it? If we look at cybersecurity, it's a very, very fast-moving, evolving market, and clearly laws haven't been able to keep up. Regulators, some would argue, have taken too much of a retrospective view. I mean, that's probably the nature of regulation. And so I think there is perhaps a feeling with some in the private sector that they've had to go it alone for a little while. So some of the things we've been talking about really, I think, are a good demonstration of how perhaps we're catching up from a law enforcement, from a regulatory perspective.
But just a question
yeah,
to
sure.
you. Question to you, because you're working with private sector entities all the time. At what point in a ransomware attack are they saying, okay, now we go to law enforcement?
That's a really good question. And it depends a little bit on the way that the organization has established its risk appetite and its ransomware response. So one of the things we're now starting to see is boards in particular having determined the amount of ransom that they will pay effectively without involving law enforcement. Now, as you know, cyber criminals are exceptionally clever. And so they do a lot of work at trying to understand what those levels are. So I think we are seeing quite an amount of crime in that space going unreported because it's simply not hitting the threshold. And it's easier, I think, for an organization to pay the money than it is to do anything else. Now, in the main, of course, that does mean that they're getting the keys to unlock the ransomware. Other organizations, though, are taking a view that is saying, well, do you know what? We're going to engage better with law enforcement right from the beginning. So I'm seeing these two sort of polar opposites, if you like. Those that are saying, as soon as it happens, we need to engage better with law enforcement, perhaps in the United States. That's down to some of the work that the FBI has been doing. It's been very, very active in reaching out to organizations to explain to them how they can cooperate better. So certainly that would be some of my American experience. But then the polar opposite would be those organizations that simply say, for the amount of money we're talking about, it's probably better for us to pay and just go with it. So yeah, it tends to be at those two extremes, I think. Either you're engaging with law enforcement right at the beginning, or indeed you're tending to sort of go it alone.
Yeah.
The concern more for me is actually the companies that are in the middle, the smaller to mid-size enterprises, because depending on which country you look at, but very many, if you take the UK, take Germany, those really are the companies that make up the vast majority of commerce. And that, I think, is where my concern comes in, because they also fit into large-scale supply chains. What can we do better to educate, improve their understanding, help them to deal with some of these instances?
And here comes the story of the question of confidence and trust. And of course, if you have cases like you had in the US now a few times, where also some of the ransom can be recovered through by law enforcement, that of course helps. And if there are more success stories like this, then there will also be more cooperation. So it can go into a direction where it's sort of a cycle where then ransomware becomes more of a peripheral issue in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the other thing that I would say, Alexander, is that we've removed now the stigma associated with ransomware and with cybercrime in general. And that's really what was behind my comment about, is it sort of business as usual? I think there's a general recognition now that you can do as much as you possibly can, but ultimately, if a cyber criminal has you in his target, then you are likely to have some kind of attack of some shape or form. And that for me is just a maturing of things as well, because it isn't about, finger pointing and blame and so on. It's about really trying to understand better how organizations can be more resilient, how they can work more collaboratively with each other, with law enforcement, to really confront what is a pretty common foe. So I think that has changed. This stigma related to my company's been hit by a ransomware attack. Well, yeah, it happens. And these are the steps that you can now take to recover from that. So I think that maturing of the space is helping us a bit here as well. I don't know what you think.
No, exactly. There is much more openness that we also see by private sector entities to discuss this, to whether they actually report in a specific case and cooperate is then another story. But that's what I'm saying. We need to create a dynamic where that goes in a positive direction, where also entities see, okay, others have been hit, others have cooperated, they managed to investigate, prosecute, recover some of the proceeds, and so on. And then hopefully in this way, you will also get much more cooperation in the future, and makes it more disruption of ransomware, more convictions also, hopefully, of offenders. And then I think we're on a good track.
Yeah, absolutely. We're coming to the end of our time together, but I wanted to ask you a couple of other quick questions. Clearly, you spend a lot of your time looking into this space, working, as you've pointed out, right the way around the world. What are some of the trends? What are some of the things that you think we can expect going forward from a cyber standpoint over the next few years that people should be aware of?
We have trends, issues at different levels, right?
Right.
We have the very practical level of systems that are being under attack, or companies that are under attack with ransomware and that sort of things. We have the issue, which is, I alluded to it a bit earlier, which has to do with content-related issues, which is a very difficult topic, because the boundary between free speech and hate speech, for example, is a very thin one.
Yes.
And so a very difficult one. And then you get into the issue of misinformation. And then you get into where's misinformation starting and electioneering, election campaigns ending, sometimes.
Yeah.
It's also not so clear. So there are a lot of these content-related issues which are very contentious. Related to is are then the human rights and rule of law issues that come with it. But on top of all of this, we also have an ideological divide around the world, which follows a bit the line of the divide of some along the military or the national security lines that we also see, where on the one hand, there are the proponents of a free and an open and global internet, where information can flow and you can cooperate with each other, and investigations only kick in and restrictions only kick in if there is misuse of and violation of laws. And then there is the other model of government-controlled cyberspace or internet, which is then much more problematic. And this is a bit the problem we are seeing right now. So if you talk about law enforcement all over the world, they're ready to cooperate with each other. If you talk about private sector companies from all over the world, they're also, many of them are happy to cooperate with each other. But if then on top of this, you have this political divide and issue globally, that makes it very difficult. And this is something we have to keep in mind, that Yes, we can work at the technical level, at the enforcement level, at the practical cooperation level, but there may always be the obstacles coming through this ideological divide, which is another level which is more difficult to influence for private sector entities, for example.
But there is, what I'm taking away from you is that we have made pretty significant progress. I get the sense that you feel that there is more progress to be made, and that for once, perhaps, the good guys are beginning to be able to fight back in a coherent and cohesive fashion.
Absolutely. And what amazes me is that I get frequently calls or messages saying, I'm a prosecutor in X. I quickly need to cooperate with my counterpart in country Y, somewhere in another continent even. And I have not failed a single time that within an hour or so they're able to talk to each other.
Right.
And this is fantastic. And this is what we have been able to create. Everyone's been able to create, those that have the spirit of cooperation over the last 10, 20 years, that people are ready to cooperate with each other in spite of all the other obstacles and politics around that.
That's fantastic, and a very positive message for us to end on. Tavia, I think, would say for a change. So, Alexander, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to me on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure, and some really interesting work that you've been involved in, and long may it continue. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Anytime, ready to cooperate.
Listeners, be sure to check the show notes for links to more ISF resources on this topic, including a recent webinar ISF hosted on mitigating ransomware attacks, and a report that ISF published in conjunction with CC Driver titled Review and Gap Analysis of Cybersecurity Legislation and Cybercriminality Policies in 8 Countries. And thanks to this week's guest, Alexander Seger. Next week, Steve is in conversation with Oxford Professor of Criminology, Federico Varese, about organized crime in cyberspace. Here's a preview.
But I suppose my personal take on what is cyber and what is the development of cyber is that most people forget one aspect, that even though you might be online and you might be sort of in a global sphere which is up there, you still are a criminal that lives in a place. So there is an offline dimension to the online dimension of cyber. And that's something I've been trying to think about as an important dimension, and we can speak about it further. You don't see cybercrime being normally distributed around the world. There are hubs, there are countries where you have a higher number of attacks to sites than others. And so there is a geographical offline dimension to cybercrime, which in a sense vindicates sort of the work I've done on the traditional mafias, because usually these offline sites are where mafias are very strong or where criminal states also operate.
We'll be back for the full conversation in a week. In the meantime, is there a topic or question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode? Let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. Find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum. Follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. And if you like the ISF podcast, we'd love it if you'd write a short review. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak. Senior producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.